The sun rose over the city of Lagos, casting golden rays across the streets. Birds chirped outside the small apartment where Toby and his daughter Bella lived. It wasn't much, a tiny cramped space with peeling walls and a leaky faucet, but it was home. "Dad, breakfast is ready," Bella called out, setting a plate of steaming jollof rice on the wooden table. Toby smiled, stepping out of the small bedroom. His daughter was his world. She had her late mother's eyes, deep and full of life, and a smile that could brighten the darkest days. She was 17 now, full of dreams, always talking about going to university and becoming a fashion designer. They sat together, eating and laughing. "One day, I'll buy you the biggest house in Lagos," Toby said, ruffling Bella's thick curls. Bella giggled. "Then I'll design all the furniture myself." For a moment, everything felt perfect. But beneath Toby's smile was a storm. His debts were piling up. The landlord had given them a final warning. His mother lay in the hospital, the bills too high to pay. Every job he tried seemed to slip through his fingers. Then came the knock on the door. A heavy, deliberate knock. Toby opened it to find two men in dark suits. They didn't need to speak. He knew why they were there. "Mr. Toby," the taller one said. "Time's up." Toby swallowed hard. "Please, just a little more time." "No more time," the man said, slipping a paper into Toby's hands. "Eviction notice. And remember, your debts aren't just numbers. People like us, we collect in different ways." His heart pounded. He knew what that meant. If he couldn't pay, they'd take more than just his home. That night he sat in the dark, staring at the eviction notice. He had nothing left to sell. Nothing except. His eyes drifted to Bella, sleeping peacefully in her bed. The thought was monstrous. But then his phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Stanley. "Meet me tomorrow. I have an offer you can't refuse." The next day Toby arrived at a towering glass skyscraper, his hands shaking. Mr. Stanley was one of the richest men in Lagos. His name carried weight, but it also carried whispers. Stories of people who vanished after dealing with him. Inside, everything smelled of leather and money. Mr. Stanley sat behind a massive desk, his suit perfectly pressed. He smiled, but his eyes were cold. "You're a desperate man, Toby," he said, lighting a cigar. "And desperate men are my favorite kind." Toby shifted in his chair. "I need money. And I need an heir," Mr. Stanley said simply. "A daughter. One I can raise in wealth, teach the ways of power." Toby's stomach turned. "You mean, you want to adopt Bella?" Mr. Stanley leaned forward. "I'll give her a life of luxury, everything you can't provide. And in return I'll pay off your debts. Completely." Toby's throat went dry. "She's my daughter." Mr. Stanley's smile widened. "She'll be safe. Well cared for. I'm not a monster, Toby. But time is running out." Toby closed his eyes. His mother needed surgery. The landlord was ready to throw them on the streets. If he said no, he'd lose everything. When he opened his eyes, he whispered, "Okay." That evening, Toby came home with an envelope full of cash. He forced a smile as he handed Bella a suitcase. "We're moving," she asked, excitement in her voice. Toby hesitated, then shook his head. "You are. To a better home with a man who will give you everything you deserve." Bella's smile faded. "What do you mean?" Toby knelt in front of her, gripping her hands. "This is for you. You'll have everything. Money, luxury, a future." Her hands trembled. "I don't want money, Dad. I want to stay with you." Toby swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's for the best, Bella." Tears welled in her eyes. "How could you do this?" But he couldn't answer. He could only watch as Mr. Stanley's black car pulled up outside. Bella sobbed as she was led away, looking back at her father one last time. And as the car disappeared into the night, Toby felt a sharp pain in his chest. He had saved himself. But he had lost his daughter. Bella sat in the back seat of the black car as it sped through Lagos, the city lights blurring past. Every mile that passed felt like she was being pulled further away from everything she had ever known. Mr. Stanley sat beside her, his expensive cologne thick in the air, his sharp eyes watching her every movement. "You're going to love your new home, Bella," he said smoothly. She kept her hands in her lap, fingers twisting together. She didn't respond. The car turned off the main road onto a quieter, darker path. Soon they passed through a massive iron gate guarded by two tall men in dark suits. They didn't speak or acknowledge her, only nodding as the car rolled past. Bella swallowed hard. The mansion that loomed ahead was nothing like the crowded streets and small apartments she was used to. It was a towering masterpiece of glass and steel, cold and unfamiliar, reflecting the moonlight. The long driveway was lined with glowing pathway lights, every hedge perfectly trimmed. It looked like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. As the car stopped, a butler rushed to open the door. "Welcome, Miss Bella," he said, bowing slightly. His face was pale, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in days. He stepped aside, waiting for her to move, but Bella hesitated before finally stepping out. The air felt strange, too still, too cold despite the warm Lagos night. She shivered as she followed Mr. Stanley into the grand foyer. Inside the house screamed wealth. The floors were polished marble, the grand chandelier sparkled like diamonds, and the walls were lined with paintings that looked older than time itself. Servants stood along the edges of the massive room, heads bowed, their movements precise and mechanical. No one smiled. No one spoke. "Come," Mr. Stanley said, his voice calm, leading her upstairs. The long hallway was eerily silent. Bella's footsteps barely made a sound on the thick carpet. She glanced at the closed doors they passed, each one looking exactly the same, tall, black and lifeless. She wondered what was behind them, but something told her she didn't want to know. "This will be your room," Mr. Stanley finally said, opening a door. Bella stepped inside and stopped. It was massive. A four-poster bed covered in silk sheets stood in the center, a chandelier hanging above it. A walk-in closet was already filled with expensive designer clothes, and glass doors led to a balcony that overlooked the vast estate. A vanity table, a massive TV, a bookshelf lined with leather-bound books. Everything about the room was perfect. It felt like a place meant for a princess. "It's all yours," Mr. Stanley said, watching her closely. Bella should have been excited, but her chest felt tight. "Why is it so quiet here?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Mr. Stanley's smile didn't waver. "You'll get used to it." Then, before she could say another word, he stepped out, closing the door behind him. A soft click echoed through the silence. Bella turned back to the room, her heart racing. She walked to the door and twisted the handle. It didn't move. Locked. Her stomach twisted as she took a step back. That night she couldn't sleep. The silence pressed against her ears, so thick that she could hear the sound of her own breathing. The bed was too soft, the air too cold, the house too still. Then just past midnight she heard it. Whispers. At first they were soft, like wind slipping through cracks. Then they grew louder. Chanting. Strange words in a language she didn't understand. Bella sat up, her heart beat loud in her ears. The sound was coming from outside her room. Slowly she crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. More whispers. Footsteps. Then a scream. Bella stumbled back, her breath ragged. Had she imagined it? The voice had sounded distant, like it had come from somewhere deep inside the mansion. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle again, twisting it harder this time. It didn't budge. She was trapped. The next morning she was allowed to leave her room. A maid knocked on her door, telling her that breakfast was ready. Bella followed her down the long, quiet halls, her mind still heavy with the memories of last night. As she entered the grand dining hall, her eyes widened at the sight before her. The table was covered with golden brown pancakes, fresh fruit, steaming cups of tea, and trays of food that looked too perfect to be real. Mr. Stanley sat at the head of the table, sipping from a cup. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the food. Bella sat down but didn't pick up her fork. "Who was screaming last night?" she asked, her voice sharper than she had intended. Mr. Stanley's expression remained calm, but his eyes darkened slightly. "You must be tired." No one screamed. Her skin prickled. She knew what she had heard. As she hesitantly ate, she noticed the servants moving around the house. They avoided eye contact, their faces empty, their movements stiff. Every time she tried to speak to one of them, they scurried away. The air in the mansion felt wrong, like something unseen was pressing against her chest, watching her. Days passed and the whispers continued. At night, doors creaked open. Footsteps moved through the halls. Sometimes she saw shadows flickering beneath her door, shapes that didn't belong to any human. The nights stretched on, heavy and endless, and Bella began to feel different. Her body was changing. She felt weaker. Her skin grew colder. She slept longer, waking up feeling drained, her limbs heavy as if something was pulling the energy out of her. Then one evening she noticed something horrifying. She stood in front of the massive mirror in her room, brushing her hair when she caught something in the reflection. She raised her hand and the girl in the mirror hesitated before copying her. Bella's blood turned to ice. She took a step forward. The reflection didn't move at the same time she did. It lagged. So wrong. She reached a shaking hand toward the glass. Her own eyes stared back at her, wide with fear. Then there was a knock at the door. Before she could react, it swung open, revealing Mr. Stanley. "You're adjusting," he said smoothly, stepping inside. Bella's heart pounded. Adjusting to what? He smiled. To your new life. And in that moment Bella knew, this wasn't a home. It was a prison. And she wasn't being adopted. She was being prepared for something else. Something much, much worse. Bella sat by the window, staring at the endless gardens outside. The mansion was beautiful, but it felt like a cage. The whispers had grown worse, creeping into her dreams, curling around her thoughts. Each night she heard the same voices, the same footsteps, the same distant screams. And each morning she woke up weaker. Her skin had lost its warmth, her hands trembled, and her reflection still moved a second too late. He had to leave. At breakfast, Mr. Stanley sat at the head of the table as always, sipping his tea, watching her with sharp, unreadable eyes. The food in front of her was untouched. "You're not eating," he observed, his voice calm. "I'm not hungry," Bella murmured. His gaze didn't waver. "You need your strength. You're adjusting. Adjusting." He kept saying that. Adjusting to what? The coldness in her bones? The strange emptiness that was creeping into her mind? The feeling that something inside her was changing, slipping away? The servants moved silently around them, their faces as blank as ever. Bella tried again to catch one of their eyes, to find some sign of life in them, but they avoided her. The way they moved was unnatural, their motions too perfect, too controlled, as if they weren't entirely human anymore. That thought sent a shiver down her spine. After breakfast, Mr. Stanley stood. "Come, I want to show you something." Bella hesitated, but refusing wasn't an option. She followed him through the grand hallways, down a long spiral staircase she had never seen before. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom was a door made of dark iron. Mr. Stanley pressed his palm against it and with a low hiss, it unlocked. Beyond it was a hallway lined with glowing blue lanterns. The walls pulsed faintly as if alive. Bella's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn back, but Mr. Stanley walked forward without hesitation. "This house is old, Bella," he said, his voice smooth, echoing against the walls. "Much older than you think. And it has secrets." They stopped at another door. It was massive, covered in strange carvings that shimmered under the lantern light. Mr. Stanley turned to her, his face unreadable. "I brought you here because I think you're ready to understand what's happening to you." Bella's hands clenched into fists. "What's happening to me? You've felt it, haven't you?" His tone was almost gentle. "The cold, the weakness, the whispers in the night. It's not sickness, Bella. It's transformation." Bella's stomach twisted. Transformation into what? Mr. Stanley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Into something more. He pushed the door open. The room beyond was enormous, the ceiling stretching impossibly high. In the center stood a raised stone platform and on it lay a girl. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly parted, her eyes closed. Bella took a step closer, and then the air left her lungs. It was her. Or someone who looked exactly like her. Her heart pounded in her chest. "What is this?" she whispered. Mr. Stanley walked to the platform, running a hand over the girl's arm. "This is what you were always meant to become." Bella stumbled back. No, this isn't real." "It's very real," he said calmly. "You see, Bella, I don't just collect wealth. I collect time. Life. And I do it through a ritual older than this city itself. This house is built on something ancient, something powerful, and it allows me to live beyond the limits of ordinary men. But to do that I need vessels. Strong ones. Ones like you." Bella's hands shook. "You're lying." Mr. Stanley tilted his head. "Aren't you already feeling it? The cold, the exhaustion? That's your body preparing. The ritual has already begun." Bella's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She thought back to the whispers, the dreams, the way her body had started changing. Had it really begun? Was she already being drained? She turned and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly, the walls seeming to close in around her. The blue lanterns flickered as she passed, casting shifting shadows against the stone. Her legs felt heavy, her vision blurred. Then suddenly hands grabbed her. She screamed, struggling against the grip, but the servants surrounded her. Their eyes were empty, their skin pale like wax. They weren't normal. They weren't human. Mr. Stanley walked toward her, slow, calm, his voice smooth as ever. "I told you, Bella. You're adjusting." She thrashed against the hands holding her. "Let me go." "You can't leave," he said simply. "Not now. Not when the process is almost complete." Bella's mind raced. She had to get out, had to escape, had to do something. She focused on the weight in her chest, the growing emptiness inside her, the cold that had been creeping into her body for days. If it was part of the ritual, then maybe it was also part of her power. She closed her eyes. For a moment nothing happened. Then a burst of energy exploded outward. The servants flew back, crashing into the walls. The lanterns flickered wildly, some shattering. Bella gasped for breath, her entire body trembling, her skin still cold but now buzzing with something else. Mr. Stanley had stopped in his tracks. He watched her with something new in his expression. Surprise. Interest. Maybe even fear. Bella didn't wait. She turned and ran, forcing her legs to move. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. Behind her, she heard Mr. Stanley laugh softly. "Good," he murmured. "You're stronger than I thought." She didn't stop running. Bella's feet pounded against the cold stone floor as she ran. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against her lungs. The hallways twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the mansion's secrets instead of out of them. The whispers grew louder, curling around her ears, filling her mind with a language she didn't understand. The shadows stretched and moved as if they were alive, reaching for her with clawed fingers. She pushed forward, ignoring the dizziness, the cold spreading through her veins. She knew she was running out of time. Whatever Mr. Stanley had done to her was almost complete. He could feel it. A door at the end of the hall. Heavy, but unlocked. She pushed it open and stumbled into a grand library. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, bookshelves lined with ancient leather-bound books reaching up to the darkness above. A fireplace crackled weakly in the corner, its flames barely giving off warmth. The room felt untouched, frozen in time. She didn't stop. She weaved through the towering shelves, her breath ragged. Somewhere there had to be another exit. A servant stepped out from behind a shelf, his pale hands reaching for her. His face was empty, eyes hollow, skin stretched too tightly over his bones. Bella didn't hesitate. She pushed her hands forward, and a surge of cold energy blasted from her fingertips. The servant flew back, hitting the shelves with a sickening crack. Books rained down around him. Bella gasped, staring at her hands. She had done that. The power inside her wasn't just draining her. It was hers to control. A slow clap echoed through the library. She turned. Mr. Stanley stood at the far end of the room, perfectly composed. His dark suit was crisp, his face unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes now. Amusement. Curiosity. "Impressive," he said. "You're adapting faster than I expected." Bella took a step back, her pulse hammering. "Stay away from me." He didn't move, but the shadows behind him did. They swirled and twisted, whispering, shifting unnaturally. "You don't understand, Bella. You were never meant to run. You were meant to rise." She shook her head. "You're lying." He took a slow step forward. "Then tell me, have you ever felt this strong before? This powerful? This alive?" Bella clenched her fists. She wouldn't listen. He had to get out. She turned and ran, forcing herself toward the nearest set of doors. But the second she touched the handle, her body locked up. The cold inside her exploded outward, paralyzing her. She gasped, her muscles seizing, her breath catching in her throat. Ice crawled up the door handle, spreading, freezing it solid. Her own body felt trapped in a layer of frost, her veins pulsing with something foreign, something unnatural. Behind her, Mr. Stanley sighed. "You still don't get it, do you?" She couldn't move. Couldn't turn. The cold inside her was no longer just a feeling. It was alive. Footsteps approached slowly. "You're not my prisoner, Bella," Mr. Stanley murmured. "You're my successor." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "No," she managed to whisper. He circled her, watching her struggle against the invisible force holding her in place. "You were chosen for a reason. This house, this power, it doesn't just take. It gives. And you, my dear, are special." The ice crackled around her fingers. The whispers in the walls grew louder. The shadows pressed in closer. She forced her body to move, to push against the power that held her. The ice resisted, but she gritted her teeth, focusing everything on breaking free. And then something inside her snapped. The ice shattered. A wave of energy burst from her chest, sending books flying, cracking the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. The power burned through her, wild and untamed. Mr. Stanley staggered back, his expression finally shifting from calm control to something else. But Bella wasted no time. She ran. This time the mansion didn't just let her go. Fought back. The walls twisted, the hallways stretched, doors disappeared the second she reached for them. The house itself was alive, and it didn't want to let her leave. She forced herself forward, dodging the shadows that clawed at her, the voices that tried to pull her under. Her body was weakening, the energy draining her faster than before. She burst through another set of doors and found herself outside. The night was thick with fog, the cold air biting against her skin. The iron gates stood in the distance, locked, guarded. The security men were already moving toward her, their eyes just as empty as the servants. She raised her hands. The power surged again. The ground froze beneath them, ice cracking up through the pavement. The guards stopped, hesitation flickering across their features. She didn't wait for them to recover. She ran. The gates. Just a little further. She reached them and gripped the iron bars. The cold inside her reacted instantly, turning the metal white with frost. With one final surge of strength she pushed. The gates shattered. The explosion of ice and metal sent her flying back, her body crashing onto the pavement. She groaned, her vision spinning, the cold threatening to pull her under completely. He had to get up. Had to move. But her limbs wouldn't obey. A shadow fell over her. Mr. Stanley. He knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. "You're not ready to leave," he said softly. Bella's breath was ragged. "I'll never be part of this." His eyes darkened. "You already are." And with that, the world around her faded into darkness. Bella's eyes fluttered open. The world around her was a blur, dark shapes moving in the shadows. Her body felt weightless, her limbs cold. She wasn't outside anymore. She was back inside the mansion, lying on something soft. Her vision cleared, and she realized she was in a dimly lit room, the ceiling high and arched, golden symbols glowing faintly along the walls. She tried to move, but a heavy force pressed her down. Mr. Stanley stood nearby, watching her. His expression was calm, almost pleased. "You fought well," he said, "but this was always going to happen. You were never meant to leave." Bella's fingers twitched. The cold inside her pulsed, the same energy that had shattered the gates. But she was too weak to summon it. The power was there, but it no longer felt like hers. It belonged to the house now. Mr. Stanley stepped closer. "Do you understand now? This was never about taking from you. It was about awakening something in you. You're not a prisoner, Bella. You're the next keeper of this power." She forced herself to speak. "I don't want it." He sighed, tilting his head. "But you are it. This power, this house, it's in you now. You can't run from it. You are the ritual." The whispers returned, swirling in her ears. She felt them inside her skull, creeping through her mind, filling her with thoughts that weren't hers. Images flashed before her. Girls before her, drained, sacrificed, lost in the walls of this house. But she wasn't like them. She wouldn't be like them. She clenched her fists, ignoring the weight pressing her down. "I won't become you." A small smile tugged at Mr. Stanley's lips. "You already have." Bella gritted her teeth. The cold surged inside her again, but this time it wasn't just taking. It was listening. The air around her trembled, the golden symbols on the walls flickering. Mr. Stanley's eyes narrowed. He could feel it too. Bella focused. She thought of every girl who had been here before her. Every whisper in the dark. Every voice that had screamed in the night. He called to them. And they answered. The room shook. The air thickened with a presence that hadn't been there before. Shadows peeled from the walls, swirling around Bella, wrapping around her arms, her legs. But they weren't attacking. They were protecting. Mr. Stanley took a step back, his composure slipping. "What are you doing?" Bella sat up, her body light as air. The whispers weren't just inside her anymore. They were hers now. The cold, the darkness, the power. It belonged to her, not to him. Mr. Stanley lunged, his hand outstretched, but the shadows coiled around his wrist, stopping him midair. His breath hitched. The control he had held for so long was slipping. "No," he muttered. "This isn't." Bella stood, the air crackling around her. "You made a mistake, Mr. Stanley. You thought you were turning me into your successor. But all you did was give me the power to end you." His eyes widened as the shadows dragged him down, pulling him toward the floor. The golden symbols on the walls shattered, the whispers growing louder, stronger. The house was waking up. The spirits that had been trapped here for years, maybe centuries, were no longer under his command. He struggled, but it was useless. His own magic, his own ritual was consuming him. The floor beneath him cracked open, darkness swirling like a void. Bella watched as his body sank, the shadows swallowing him whole. His last words were a whisper, barely audible. "You don't know what you've unleashed." Then he was gone. The house groaned. The walls trembled. The whisper softened. The heavy weight pressing on Bella's chest lifted. She took a breath. The air felt different now. Lighter. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt free. She turned toward the door. It swung open on its own. The mansion, once suffocating, now seemed almost peaceful. The servants, no, not servants, victims, stood outside the room, their eyes no longer hollow. The control Mr. Stanley had over them was gone. They were free too. Bella walked past them, her footsteps light, the cold no longer a burden but a part of her. She stepped out into the night. The sky was clear. The city lights in the distance flickered like stars. She had survived. But she wasn't the same girl who had entered this house. She never would be again.